The body cam footage runs 11 minutes and 42 seconds. In that time, a man kneels beside a body. He clasps his hands. He leads a prayer, out loud, by name, specific. The responding officers step back out of respect. A neighbor who watched later said it was the most moving thing she had ever seen at a crime scene. The man doing the praying killed that person 6 hours earlier. That footage became central evidence in the trial, not because of what the man said, because of what every trained behavioral analyst eventually noticed he did not do, what his body did not do, what his face did not do, the things that cannot be faked once you know exactly what to look for. My name is Danny Cruz. I spent 11 years at the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times covering crime, courts, and the systems that either catch killers or let them walk free. I don't have a badge. I have documents. And this case is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of a behavioral phenomenon that the FBI has studied for decades. The killer who inserts themselves directly into the aftermath of what they did. Tonight, I'm walking you through the body cam footage, the behavioral science behind what it captured, the investigative blind spots that almost let this man go free, and what the trial ultimately produced. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now. I cover cases where the documented record tells the story. No speculation, no invented details, just what's in the file. Let's go. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has a specific term for this pattern. They call it investigative insertion. It appears in their published work, in academic criminology literature, and in law enforcement training materials that have been publicly available for years. The documented pattern is highly specific. Certain offenders, after committing a crime, deliberately position themselves as helpers, witnesses, grievers, or community leaders in the investigation that follows. The reasons are layered and well documented. Control over information. Intelligence gathering about what investigators know and when they know it. The psychological reward of watching an entire community search for someone the offender knows is standing right in front of them. Retired FBI profiler and BAU researcher Ann Burgess documented this behavior pattern across decades of case files. The phenomenon is not rare. It appears in a significant percentage of cases where the offender had a prior relationship with the victim and belonged to a community that trusted them. Religious leaders, coaches, first responders, and family members all appear in that documented offender population. The insertion serves a multi-layered function. It gives the offender real-time access to investigative intelligence, and it weaponizes the community's pre-existing trust as a protective shield. The pastor in this case had served his congregation for over a decade. He had officiated funerals. He had counseled families through loss, addiction, divorce. He had sat at hospital bedsides. He had built a reputation that the community had spent years reinforcing through every interaction. That reputation was not an accident in terms of what it later provided him operationally. The documented case files show he was one of the first people called when the body was discovered. He arrived before some of the responding officers. He was already on scene, already in prayer, when the first body cam footage began rolling. That timing matters enormously. The investigators who reviewed the case later noted that his early arrival gave him access to the scene before it was fully secured. He could observe what evidence was being documented and where. He could hear what the officers said to each other, their working theories, their initial observations, and he could perform his grief in front of the exact people who would later be asked by detectives whether he seemed like someone capable of what the evidence would eventually prove he had done. The behavioral analysis of the body cam footage begins at the 2-minute mark. That is when the first responding officer approaches the man and asks him to step back from the body. The man complies immediately. His movement is fluid. There is no resistance, no hesitation, no stumble in the step. That is the first documented flag. Genuine, acute grief, particularly in individuals who have just received news of a violent death of someone they knew closely, produces what researchers call a cognitive motor disruption. The body does not move smoothly because the brain is not processing efficiently. The coordination between thought and physical action is interrupted by the flood of cortisol and adrenaline. The absence of that disruption is not proof of guilt by itself, but it is what analysts call a notable absence, a place where the observed behavior and the claimed emotional state do not align with documented research findings. The second flag comes at the 3-minute 40-second mark. The officer, speaking softly and directly, asks the man, "Did you know her well?" The man's response takes 1.8 seconds. That pause is documented specifically in the behavioral analysis report submitted to the prosecution team. In documented grief responses, particularly when the deceased is someone the grieving person was close to, there is typically an immediate verbal response, sometimes only a single word, sometimes just a sound, before the full answer comes. The cognitive system floods with memory and association and emotion. Grief interrupts the answer before it can be completed. The pause the pastor took was not a grief pause. According to the behavioral expert who later testified at trial, it was a retrieval pause. He was selecting what to say. He was composing. The third flag is the one that gets discussed most in behavioral science literature that has since cited this case as a documented example. At the 6-minute mark, a second officer approaches and says the name of the deceased, clearly in a normal conversational tone. The pastor is looking at the ground when this happens. He does not look up when the name is said. In documented studies of grief response and personal loss, research conducted by psychological teams studying acute bereavement reactions, hearing the name of a deceased person you were genuinely close to produces an involuntary orienting response. The head moves. The eyes move toward the sound source. The body turns. It is a reflex connected to deeply wired human processing of a familiar name, amplified by the acute emotional state of grief. The pastor's head did not move. His eyes did not track. He remained still in a way that is documented in behavioral analysis research as consistent with someone managing information rather than receiving it for the first time. These flags, taken individually, do not prove anything. The behavioral analysts who reviewed the footage were explicit and careful about this at trial. Each observation, examined alone, falls within the range of normal human variation in stress responses. What makes them significant is what investigators found when they looked at the timeline, the physical evidence, and the pastor's own documented account of his movements that afternoon. The victim was found at 9:47 p.m. The estimated time of death, established through body temperature readings, liver temperature analysis, and entomological analysis of the scene, placed her death between 2:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. that afternoon. That is a documented forensic finding, not a single method estimate, but a convergence of multiple independent forensic indicators that the defense's own retained expert could not successfully challenge during cross-examination. The forensic window was solid. The pastor told investigators he had not seen the victim since the previous Sunday's service. He said this twice, once in his initial informal conversation with officers at the scene that night, again in a formal recorded interview the following morning. That account was then checked against documented records. Cell tower data placed his phone within a 200-meter radius of the location where the body was found at 3:17 p.m. that afternoon. That is a 5-hour and 42-minute discrepancy between where he said he was and where the digital record placed him. He told investigators his phone was with him at all times. His own statement placed his phone at the scene during the forensic window. The physical evidence added another documented layer. Trace forensic analysis of the victim's clothing recovered fibers consistent with a fabric type used in furniture commonly found in institutional and pastoral settings. The specific fiber type, a woven polyester blend in a color cataloged as burgundy in the manufacturer's documentation, matched upholstery samples taken from the pastor's office chair during the subsequent court-authorized search. Fiber evidence is not a fingerprint. Experienced prosecutors are careful about over-reliance on fiber analysis in isolation, and they should be. But in combination with the cell tower data, the fiber evidence formed part of a documented physical evidence trail that gave investigators a foundation to build on. The alibi the pastor provided, that he had spent the afternoon at his home preparing his Sunday sermon, was verifiable in principle. He said he had participated in a video call with a member of his leadership team. Investigators requested the platform records directly. The video call log showed the call lasted 19 minutes, ending at 1:53 p.m. His claimed alibi had ended 97 minutes before the cell tower placed his phone at the scene. There was no documented record of his whereabouts for that gap. No receipts, no other calls, no witnesses who placed him at home, nothing. Here is where the systemic failure becomes clearly visible in the record. The initial investigative approach treated the pastor as a community resource to draw on, not as a person of interest to scrutinize. This is the documented pattern that behavioral science researchers have identified as a recurring and costly problem in cases involving trusted authority figures. Investigators, often operating entirely unconsciously, apply what researchers call social proof bias. The community's established trust in the individual functions as an implicit character reference that shapes the investigative posture from the very beginning. Questions that would be asked of an ordinary witness are softened or delayed. Follow-up inquiries that would be automatic in other contexts are deferred. The authority figure is treated as part of the investigative team rather than as a potential subject of the investigation. Documentation from the case file shows that the pastor was not formally asked to account for the unverified 97-minute gap in his alibi until the third formal interview, which took place 5 days after the body was discovered. 5 days. In those 5 days, the investigation had been directed in other directions. Potential physical evidence had a 5-day window to degrade. Environmental trace evidence at locations he might have visited was exposed to weather and foot traffic. Witness memories of what they had seen that afternoon were fading and being contaminated by community discussion of the tragedy. That delay is not the result of individual incompetence. It is the result of a systemic and documented pattern in how law enforcement processes cases involving trusted community figures. A study published in the Journal of Investigative Psychology examined 47 cases where a trusted community authority figure was eventually convicted of homicide. In 31 of those cases, 66%, the figure was not formally named as a person of interest until at least 72 hours after the initial investigation began. In cases involving clergy specifically, the average delay was 4 days and 9 hours before formal scrutiny began. The researchers noted that this delay is not random, it is predictable. It correlates with the social standing and institutional authority of the offender within the community. The higher the trust, the longer the delay. In this case, the 5-day delay did not ultimately prevent the case from being built. The cell tower data, the fiber evidence, and the behavioral analysis of the Bodycam footage were all recoverable and usable. What investigators could not fully recover was whatever might have been present at the scene and nearby locations in the initial hours. Trace evidence, environmental conditions, potential witness observations that were not captured because the scene was not immediately treated as a homicide, with a likely suspect already standing inside the perimeter. The pivot came on day 6. A member of the congregation came forward with a text message. This person had received a text from the pastor on the afternoon of the death. The text asked a specific question about the victim's schedule, whether she was typically at the church building during afternoon hours on weekdays. That message was time-stamped at 2:04 p.m. The documented forensic window for the time of death began at 2:30 p.m. The proximity of that timestamp to the forensic window, a gap of 26 minutes between when he asked where she would be and when the forensics say she died, stopped the investigation and forced a complete reset. The pastor was formally designated a person of interest on day 6. Searches of his office and vehicle followed on day 7, pursuant to court-authorized warrants. The warrant applications drew on the documented evidence chain the investigators had built. The cell tower data, the fiber analysis, the behavioral analysis of the Bodycam footage, and the 2:04 p.m. text message. Each element was independently sourced. Each was independently verifiable. The defense would later attempt to challenge each one in isolation. That strategy did not succeed because the prosecution's case was built on convergence rather than dependence on any single piece. At trial, the prosecution's approach was methodical and careful. The behavioral analyst who testified about the Bodycam footage spent 2 full hours on the stand. She was precise in her language. She did not tell the jury the footage proved he was guilty. She told them the footage documented specific behavioral patterns that were inconsistent with the documented physiological and behavioral responses of acutely bereaved individuals, and consistent with the documented patterns of individuals consciously managing the performance of an emotional state they were not actually experiencing. She cited published peer-reviewed research. She cited FBI behavioral training documentation. She cited her own published work in the field and the methodology she used to analyze the footage. The defense brought its own expert. That expert argued, correctly as a matter of scientific principle, that behavioral analysis of video footage involves interpretation, that no universal standard exists for what grief must look like in a given individual, and that cultural background, personality type, and individual trauma history can all produce atypical grief presentations. The defense expert's critique of behavioral analysis methodology in the abstract was not wrong. The prosecution's rebuttal did not dispute it. Instead, the rebuttal focused on what it had always been focused on: convergence. No single behavioral flag made the case. The combination of documented behavioral anomalies, an established physical evidence trail, a cell tower record that directly contradicted his stated alibi, a text message timestamped 26 minutes before the forensic window opened, and a 97-minute gap he could never account for. That combination was what the jury was being asked to evaluate as a whole. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. They asked to review the body cam footage twice during deliberations. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase produced statements from members of the congregation that were entered into the record. What several of them said, on record, in court, in documented testimony, is something that appears repeatedly in behavioral science literature on cases involving trusted authority figures. They did not feel only grief or anger at the outcome. They felt what researchers who study community victimization describe as a betrayal multiplier, the compound damage done not only by the crime itself, but by the specific fact that the person who committed it had been trusted with access to the community's most vulnerable moments: funerals, hospital visits, marital crises, addiction recoveries, family tragedies. The congregation had given this man access to their worst hours and their deepest fears, and he had stood in front of them, on camera, in prayer, over a body he had put there 6 hours earlier. That is what the FBI's documented research on investigative insertion means in practice, not as an abstract behavioral category, but as a lived event. The insertion is not purely tactical. It is also a demonstration of the offender's belief that the trust they have constructed is an asset they control and can spend as needed. The community's grief becomes leverage. Their shock becomes cover. Their faith in the person's fundamental goodness becomes a resource to draw on in real time, in front of a camera, in front of officers who step back out of respect. The documented behavioral science around this specific pattern now includes this case as a cited example. Law enforcement training programs that address the investigation of trusted authority figures reference the body cam footage from this case as a documented illustration of what analysts call managed grief performance, the construction of an outward emotional display that hits the recognizable marks of grief without the underlying physiological and motor correlates that genuine acute grief reliably produces. The absent orienting response when the victim's name was spoken, the fluid, uninterrupted motor control, the 1.8-second retrieval pause before answering a simple relational question, the stillness where disruption should have been. None of those observations individually would have built a prosecutable case. The physical evidence built the case. The cell tower data provided the direct contradiction of his stated alibi. The 2:04 p.m. text message provided the intent evidence. The behavioral analysis gave the jury a structured, research-supported framework for understanding what they were watching in 11 minutes and 42 seconds of footage that a casual observer might have found genuinely moving. That is the systemic failure this case documents most precisely. The behavioral indicators were visible in the footage from the beginning. The community's trust in this man's authority created enough institutional friction that a formal investigative posture, the kind that asks pointed questions and demands documented accountability, did not begin for 5 days. The physical evidence chain survived those 5 days. It has not always survived in other cases. The documented research produces specific recommendations for investigations involving trusted authority figures. Earlier and more structured formal interviewing. Explicit protocols for assessing behavioral observations against documented baselines rather than social impression. institutional acknowledgement of the social proof bias that predictably shapes investigative posture in these cases. These recommendations exist in published form. They are available. Whether they are implemented consistently, whether agencies build them into standard procedure before the next case rather than examining them in retrospect after, is the question the research cannot answer. Only the next case will. If you want more cases where the documented record tells the complete story, the behavioral science, the forensic evidence trail, the systemic failures that shape every outcome, subscribe and stay on this channel. The next video is already queued. The record exists. You just have to know how to read it.